The other thing that we do is record your podcast in video, because traditionally we think of podcasts just being audio, but we've seen a big switch in that. I know you do your podcast, Scott, in video as well.
Yeah.
So even though they may not be consuming it, and the numbers still show that most people do listen to podcasts, they don't watch podcasts. But by recording in a video, it gives you those clips. So just like what Mike did last week, and he pulled those video clips, turned them into content. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mortgage Influencers, where we bring you professionals who share insight into the latest trends, tips, industry technology, and services to help you be a mortgage influencer in your mortgage business. Okay, so welcome to another episode of Mortgage Influencers. It is Wednesday, so we're happy to have everyone joining us. For those who are watching us live on our Facebook, hello, happy Wednesday. My name is Ginger Bell. I have Scott Schang with me. Hey, Scott.
Hello, I am back.
Our other host, Steve, is traveling again, so he is in the air, not with us. So we wish him safe travels.
Man, his arms have got to be tired. He's been flying for the last 2 weeks.
Yes.
Poor guy.
Great. But we have a very special guest today who's joining us, who I have had the pleasure of knowing for, probably about the last 10 years or so. And that is Nate Clear. Nate is the National Sales Manager for First Funding, and First Funding provides warehouse lines of credit to non-delegated correspondents and correspondent lenders across the country. And so welcome, Nate. We're happy to have you join us today.
Hey, thanks as always for being on. It's a pleasure. Ginger, as always, it's a lot of fun working with you. And yeah, it's been a decade plus now. So it's been pretty awesome.
Yeah. So one of the things I really want to talk about, and we're just going to dive right in, is Nate. First Funding has been a client of mine for a long time. And, we've always worked on really providing resources, especially for non-delegated correspondents, on how you go from being, broker to banker, what that looks like. Edu marketing is at the core of everything that you do, that we've always built. And so a few months ago, you came to me with an idea that you wanted to really provide to the industry a resource center for non-delegated correspondents. And so the first thing you wanted to do was to create just that, an online resource center where companies could go find out not just how to go through that transition of becoming a non-delegated, but also how to thrive as a non-delegated. And so part of beginning with the resource center, which is live now, was really raising awareness and bringing additional tools to non-Dels to be able to help them in their business. And you've done that with your podcast, which is a non-Del Influencers podcast. So first of all, good on you for recognizing a need and acting on it. So thank you for that. And the next, the first question is, I want to talk about really the podcast and how you see that as being able to share information. Has that been easy for you in getting started with the podcast?
Yeah, I would say, quite frankly, my commute from my house to the office is only about 15 minutes or so. And I haven't been an avid listener of podcasts, but I knew that webinars are not getting it done because it's sterile. It's not conversational. It's not, everything's very well rehearsed. You've got slide deck, you do it one time, and then you're trying to get other people into it. So I knew we needed to do something besides that and not just creating necessarily static videos of similar to that. So I knew, really in talking to you that, podcast is really where you need to be. So when we first got started, I was trying to make it too much of like a episodic television where I know all my lines, I know all the questions that I'm going to ask, and try and have them pre-written ahead of time. And that's certainly not the way to go. I think we're in our 9th, 10th episode now, and I think we've got a lot better flow to the podcast where now when I get in the car with my wife, I'm like, hey, listen to my new podcast that just came out. She's even saying like, okay, cool, I can actually listen to this because it's a conversation. And she's not from mortgage, right? So if I can get somebody not from mortgage to actually be able to follow along in the conversation and not be bored out of their mind, I think that's a success. So I think it's just, you gotta, the other side of it is that I think, Scott, hats off to you for continuing to get these episodes done, because it is a commitment, right? Ahead of time, making sure that you've got something that's going to be worthwhile for your audience to listen to. It's not something that you hear day in, day out. It's not, how to do an e-mortgage that you see at every single conference and they say the exact same thing over and over again, right? Like, I don't want to talk about that over and over again, right? And so you need to have that same type of interaction in your podcast. And so it's not necessarily the easiest thing, but it's something that we're continuing to strive for. And I think that, a lot of the content that you're finding in the Non-Del Influencers podcast, that's what you're going to get out of it.
I have a question about that, because that's really interesting, because you kind of jump off the cliff and build the airplane on the way down on a lot of this stuff. What was it specifically? What was the feedback loop, or what was it that changed specifically from episode 1 to that you're changing now? Like what specifically happened? What was the feedback loop and what was the change?
Yeah. So the initial episode was, and of course, right. The beauty of the way that I'm doing mine is we pre-record them and then we put them out so I can move them around. So I strategically put like my better one forward. But the first recording that we did for the first, podcast was really centered around what we're trying to teach you. And it didn't have any other kind of heart or soul or fun about it, where like in the one that we did,
a start here episode,
episode, right? Yeah. And so like that's great, like if you really want to know like what we're trying to do, and I think that that's important. But like in yesterday's episode, we talked with an AMC, right? And we're really talking about differences between wholesale to correspondent, what those changes look like for an independent originator in each one of those hats when talking to an AMC and some of the other things around it. But what we found we're bringing in real life situations. We're talking about college. We're talking about kids. We're talking about personal experience, right? Funny things, funny scenarios. So now it becomes, it's conversational. It's not, first step, you do this. And then second, you need to make sure you CDP. And then third, you need to make sure that you're working with this person and don't do that. And so it flows much better.
I equate it to, if you have an opportunity, like if the three of us were to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about the challenges non-delegated correspondents are having right now in the industry. And, Scott, you're doing a ton around AI right now. So it's like, okay, if I'm a non-del, how am I going to use that in promoting that as a leveraged opportunity to stand out? And how could I bring AI into that? And so, we would have a conversation, we'd probably roadmap some of that out. And it's like, imagine it's like being able to be a fly on a wall in a think tank. It's kind of like what a good podcast is, because you're having that conversation. And for example, Nate was talking about, so John Tallinger, who, Scott, I know and he's a great leader in the industry, does a fantastic job with their AMC. And one of my big takeaways in recording the podcast with y'all yesterday was he talked about white glove service. Now, he was talking about it in his business, but what I'm listening to that is like, wow, that makes me think about what in my business do I offer that is that white glove service. That is not something that would be part of a PowerPoint, as you say, a webinar, something like that. It was part of a conversation.
Yep.
And so that's what podcasts do, is allow you to act as if you're just sitting down, having a conversation, talking about a what if, how can you, best practices, things like that, and allowing your listeners to follow along with it. And so that's the thing I love personally about podcasts. And also, you don't have to make a PowerPoint.
Yeah, you can get the content, you can get the point across, you can provide the education piece, but yeah, you don't have to do a whole production ahead of it. And I think you still get your message across just the same, if not even better,
Right.
because you're not sitting through another classroom setting type of situation.
And it allows people to listen at any time. Yesterday was probably a longer podcast of what you've had. But usually, we keep ours to 30 minutes, and oftentimes we'll go over, and it's like, we honestly have to stop. It's like, okay, we're at the top of the hour, which I love, because it's almost like it makes your listeners like, hey, have them come back. And we see that often in the comments and the follow-up. It's like, hey, can you have them come back again? And can you talk about this? And so that's what's great. You're doing a good podcast when you get that.
Yeah. And I do think it's funny, right? Because to your point, Ginger, like when we first started doing this, you're like, hey, you should listen to some podcasts so that you can get a better feel for it. And I started listening to some other podcasts that are out there. And it's like, okay, I'm 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I'm like, how long is this podcast going to, this particular episode? Because some of them are like 2 hours,
Yeah.
And
Joe Rogan, I mean, his are definitely like way up there.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
for some of those, I was just like, okay, well, I don't have the time for that. But I agree, Ginger. I think that try and keep them around 30 minutes. That's what people are able to digest without losing their train of thought. And now they're thinking about what they got to do for the rest of the day.
And it's a good commute time. Usually yours is a little bit shorter, luckily, which is unusual in Dallas. But it's also like, if you're going to hop on the treadmill, if you're going to go for a walk, I mean, that's normally what you want to think about, is doing that. 100%. The other thing, when you have 30 minutes of content, you can pull little clips out of them. I call them drop the mic moments. And that gives you additional content. And so many times, you talk to people, it's like, I just had a call with a client this morning, and we're creating a newsletter for them. And he's like, I can come up with videos for realtors every week. And he said, I struggle with coming up with videos for consumers. And so for him, that was a stretch to be able to do that. It's like, well, we can just take clips out of your podcasts. And those are nice little things to use for your shorts, for your TikToks, for things like that. And Scott, you're probably running into that because you have been slaying it on your AI training that you're doing. And so honestly, probably you can start taking some of those clips out of there and using that for your short content as well. So your long form content can also be utilized for short form content. And that's what I love about with doing podcasts.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience with the short form. I'm not really on a lot of short form platforms. I did do shorts because I am on YouTube, but one of my biggest weaknesses I've never really tried to figure out how to game the system. I just do it. I have something to say and I'm just going to say it. I don't care who's listening, because if somebody actually sits through the whole thing and it resonates with them, those are my people. Right. So it's more quality and not quantity. But I started doing the shorts, and it's a different audience and they have a different relationship with you. There's a lot more trolls in short short content, because the algorithm is showing it to people that aren't necessarily into you. And I think if you're on those platforms, you should be doing that, and there's no better way to do it. I think Mike, we had Mike on last week. He and I did a podcast, and he pulled out like 9 clips that he used for social media for the next 2 weeks out of that one podcast. It's brilliant. And I also think, like, the way that you're doing it, Nate, especially like somebody, a personality like JT, like there's like you just forget that the camera's rolling, because you've got like an engaging person, and like stuff is just, you can't script that stuff out. You know, you just can't script that stuff out, and it just turns into, and I guess that's kind of where I was going with my question. And it sounds like you very quickly clicked into, hey, this is just an interesting person. We're going to have a conversation mode. And you know, I say there's two ways that people get good at content. It's either that they either learn how to do it and they feel comfortable in what they're doing, or they just don't care anymore. And it's like, and I always found when you get to where you just don't care anymore, it's like, JT's a cool dude. We could have a conversation for an hour, and no problem, and just record it. And like, that's the best content. That's the best material. So yeah, I mean, you've got a good coach in your corner because you came to that realization really fast.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is that, you know, I'm fortunate or unfortunate, I've spent a ton of time on the road. So we know a lot of people throughout the industry. And, you know, kind of the backbone of my podcast in particular is, you know, non-delegated correspondents, but moreover, people that, you know, aren't familiar with traditional, you know, wholesale channel, being independent, et cetera. You know, there's a lot of retail folks out there, certainly in the current environment, that are like, hey, margin compression, et cetera, I'm going to go out on my own, but they need a resource, which was, you know, the impetus for the website. Then it was like, well, how do you promote the website? You're not going to do static screens, et cetera. That's where the podcast really came in. And so, you know, just like everything else in the mortgage industry, it's a huge food chain, and you've got really interesting, fascinating people in some of the most perceived boring areas of the industry. So if we can find those right people, have those conversations, 100%, it kind of, it speaks for itself. It builds its own following, because they know the people that are going to be on there are going to have something to say, and it's not static. It's not, you know, it's not prepackaged. It's raw, it's real, and it's interesting.
Well, and even the fact, because most people think, okay, you're B2B. And so most people think if you're going to do a podcast, you can't do it B2B because your audience is small. It's like, oh, audience is small. It's like, your audience is your audience, and you should be talking to them no matter, you know, whether it's your B2C or B2B, or if you're doing one for realtors, it's providing a value to your audience. And so that's the first thing, is who's your audience? That's who the conversation is. You want to have a conversation with your audience. Podcasts provide that on a continuing basis in a format that they can digest it how they want to. I mean, it's on all the directories, all the different platforms of, if they're listening on Spotify or Apple or Pandora or, you know, Amazon, I mean, whatever, they can listen to it. The other thing that we do is record your podcast in video, because traditionally we think of podcasts just being audio, but we've seen a big switch in that. I know you do your podcast, Scott, in video as well. So even though they may not be consuming it, and the numbers still show that most people do listen to podcasts, they don't watch podcasts. But by recording in a video, it gives you those clips. So just like what Mike did last week, and he pulled those video clips, turned them into content, and he was crazy as far as, I mean, he had watching the times and the algorithms and everything that was on social as far as when it worked, which was great for him. But it gives you that additional content. So you have two hosts, and so it's you and Nick that do the podcast. I want to talk about that because we've had several hosts. We do our podcast. We've had several hosts. Scott has been with me. He's my steady. He started with me at the beginning when I called him and I said, hey, I'm thinking I want to do this and start this, you know, podcast. We're going to stream weekly. And are you in? And he's like, I'm in. And he's been here consistently. So thank you for that, my friend. But we do have more than one host. And so for you, how has that been, having someone else as a host?
For me, Ginger?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a lifesaver, right? Because there's sometimes you don't always get somebody that's, you know, in terms of who you're interviewing, that's going to be able to talk a lot.
Right.
You know, Nick, who's our co-host, he can talk to a brick wall. So, Literally, David would just kind of, hey, and Nick, whatever JT said, what do you think? Something that simple, and he can just go off for 5 minutes, right? That aspect is very helpful to have, especially when you're blanking on. I was expecting these last 3 questions that I asked you to go on more than a sentence each. It's nice to have somebody that you can kind of, bail out. The other side of it is that you want to be consistent. And if for whatever reason I'm not able to be there, you still have somebody that can do the interview. And so I think that's the, kind of the other aspect of having somebody in there. I will say one of the things that, I need to, or we need to get better at is playing more off of each other. Because, Scott, as you mentioned, JT's a prime candidate for, webinar, because you can talk to him all day long. You don't want to hog the conversation, and then you got this guy that kind of chimes in 2 or 3 times in the podcast, and it's kind of like, well, he's just standing over there smiling, looking at me. So I think that's a piece that, you don't want to have too many cooks in the kitchen, because then everybody's trying to watch out and make sure that they don't step on the other person's toes when they're responding. But it's just kind of something that I've seen. What's your experience been?
I'm going to let Scott handle it, because we've had up to 4 co-hosts on our podcast. And so you kind of have to get really good at reading the room.
Yeah.
And being a good listener. And I think that's the thing when you do podcasts, that you have to be a good listener, but then also setting it up for other hosts. So like Scott, what are the things that you're seeing as far as co-hosting?
Yeah, well, when we had the Marketing Trench podcast that I did for 3 years with Dustin Stevie and Ricardo Bueno, it was the 3 of us, and then we would bring guests on. And that's it. You kind of just get into the groove. You kind of know where they're good at. And that's something that you and I do pretty well. You're like, you'll say like, Scott, why don't you tackle that one? But I mean, there's absolutely episodes that I say 2 words. Like there's just, the conversation is too good. That's another part of it, is you don't always have to be a part of every conversation. Sometimes you just let it flow. But having the pressure off of you and having those different perspectives, because I think that's the important part, is when you're just interviewing somebody, you're kind of forcing the content through your perspective. But when you have a different person, they're going to ask a question in a way that makes you think. And that's what I find, that's the hardest thing for me on like this podcast, is we've got such smart people on here, and like I'll have a question and then Ginger will ask something, or Steve will ask something that makes me think of a completely different perspective. I'm like, wow, that was a smart angle. I didn't think about that. And then I'll want to say something. But yeah, I mean, you just get to learn I think it's more entertaining when you have, more than one person on there. But you just have to learn to work with them. And it's the hardest thing to learn, to not speak over other people. You want to say something so bad, but you just have to kind of wait and remember your thought and then bring it back. But kind of like what we just did right now, I find this tends to be the case more often than not. I've got like a little 45-second spiel that I just did, and now I'm going to get off. I'm going to get off, and then you guys are going to take it over. So you kind of have to get all your thoughts together, punch them out, and then wait for your time on the round robin. Hopefully a question will come back to you.
Right. And I think that because it sounds awful, right? Whenever you are talking over, like when I re-listened to it and it's like, we're both trying to talk at the same point in time. It's like, for the listener, it's awful. It just sounds so disorganized, right? And it's just normal, right? Like if we're in the same room having a conversation, I think it would make a little bit more sense. But I listen to a lot of talk radio, and you hear those guys, and they have their timing perfect. But to your point, Scott, all day, every day, right? Or for whatever period that they're doing their bits on, they're having to watch that kind of fine line of taking turns, but having a conversation. It's just a different way of communicating.
And it is like talk radio. I mean, podcasts are the new talk radio.
Mhm.
And so, and you don't, I mean, you don't have to be a personality. You can have a co-host who can help you. You can tee up with questions. And I want to talk about that. So for questions, for you, again, something different. So you're talking, your audience is mortgage brokers, mortgage bankers, non-delegated correspondents. And so having a conversation with them is different than if you're doing a podcast for real estate agents or a podcast for consumers. So do you lead in with a set of questions for each guest that you kind of have outlined? What kind of prep do you do?
Yeah, I try to leave it to about, I don't know, anywhere from 10 to 15 questions or points that I want to give to whoever, we're going to have the interview with. And really it just kind of depends. It sets out kind of the tone of what the conversation is going to be about. But the biggest thing that I, emphasize, ahead of time is this is really light. This is easy breezy. Let's keep it as conversational as possible. And so in a lot of cases, I find that really we hit 6 out of the, 10 or 15 points. And that's sufficient to get the conversation piece going, because sometimes, right, Scott, to your point, sometimes you get going down, one avenue, and then a question that you think the answer and what they're going to respond with actually ends up going down another avenue. And now we're kind of abandoning the original game plan of what we're going to talk about. And let's go explore this a little bit more until, okay, well, we need something else to talk about. Cool. We can pull something, that we've got kind of, hey, we know that this could be coming up. I know that it certainly helps whoever we're having the conversation with, because they get a chance to kind of go, okay, I know what I want to talk about when these types of things come up. But I think the fun and organic thing is what happens kind of in the in between of those lines, when you can kind of ask, some of those other questions and open up. So that's, we want to have a certain element of an objective that's in each of those interviews. And then the rest of it, you really want it to be, organic and fun and something that you enjoy listening to.
Exactly. So how are you inviting? Because I know you say, and you do, you travel a lot, showtime's coming up, we're coming into trade show season. And so how are you inviting the people you meet onto your podcast?
Yeah, I did originally start with emails and asking for dates and times and that kind of stuff. That works, but then it almost seems like it's more of a like a webinar setup type deal. And I am finding that when I took that approach, that's what I get. So instead, I've switched to text and phone calls to people in the industry. Hey, what's your schedule look like over the next couple of weeks? Hey, can I get you on my podcast? It'll be 20, 30 minutes tops. Yeah, man, not a problem. You shoot me the calendar invite. I'll keep that open for you. And then it's like the day before or 2 days before, I'm like, hey, heads up, once again, very conversational. You don't need to prepare anything. Here's a list of 10 things that, we may get around to talking about. And that has definitely made it, I think, a lot better for both ends. So it's a lot of personal people that I know that are known in the industry that have a lot of people that will listen to them. And it's because they're experts in their field, but most of them are also salespeople. So they're good at talking. And so they're fun to have on. And I think that's, one of the things that I'll try and continue to gravitate towards. But it's like, if I could ever get like Doug Duncan from Fannie on, like, he's an economist that can actually talk, and he's fun to listen to. He's got jokes and that kind of stuff. Like it's finding that, similar to like a Rob Chrisman, he can talk, right? It's not all boring. So, it's just know who you're bringing on, and have a good time.
Yeah. And the nice thing is they have a network. So they have a following as well. Which is a whole nother thing. And we're at the top of the hour. So I think that's the next conversation as far as how do you leverage that network once you have that done? How do you support them and giving them the clips, the talking points, so they can send it out, because I think that's the thing when you're doing a podcast, it's not just you now, it's them. And so what are the things you can do to be able to help share that? So that'll be our next conversation. But we are going to close it out. And I want to thank everyone for listening and tuning in. And also, Nate, where can they find you and your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, would love to have you subscribe to non-del-influencers-podcast.com. That's where you can find the podcast. Non-del-influencers.com is the resource guide for anybody that's interested in non-delegated correspondent, going independent, etc. It's a great treasure trove of information. Feel free to reach out to me. Firstfundingusa.com is our company website. You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, all that good stuff. Love to have a conversation if you're interested in podcast or warehouse lending, whatever.
Yeah. And if you are, so guys, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about, hey, I'm a broker, what are the opportunities in becoming a non-del, especially in this landscape? Nate and his team are seriously the best as far as helping you through that transition. And I think that is so important. So Nate, thank you so much for joining us. Scott, as always, thank you. And we look forward to seeing everyone next week. Remember, we meet here every week, Wednesday, 1:30 p.m. Pacific time. And next week, our guest will be Steve Kiles with the Mortgage Marketing Animal. So we look forward to seeing you. Thanks, guys. Bye, Nate. Bye,
Thanks,
Scott.
Nate.
See ya.